The silence in the hospital room was deafening as I stared at the ultrasound screen where my baby's heartbeat should have been. Dr. Martinez's gentle voice explaining the miscarriage felt like it was coming from underwater. But it was my mother-in-law. Patricia's sharp intake of breath that cut through the fog. "Well, I'm not surprised," she said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Working 60-hour weeks, all that stress, ignoring my advice about proper nutrition. This is exactly what I warned would happen. My husband David just stood there, silent, as his mother blamed me for losing our child. What Patricia didn't know was that tucked away in my home office was a manila envelope containing documents that would destroy everything she held dear. But I wasn't ready to use it yet. 3 months earlier, I had been on top of the world. My name is Jessica Chen-Morrison, and at 32, I was the youngest partner ever at Hartwell Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious accounting firms. My specialty was forensic accounting, which meant I spent my days unraveling financial mysteries, tracking down hidden assets, and exposing corporate fraud. I had built my reputation on being meticulous, relentless, and absolutely incorruptible. Clients paid premium rates for my ability to find what others wanted to keep hidden. My office on the 42nd floor of the Willis Tower offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan, and on clear days, I could see all the way to Indiana. The walls were lined with my certifications, awards, and photographs from various professional conferences where I had been the keynote speaker. At 32, I owned a penthouse apartment in Lincoln Park, drove a Tesla Model S, and had an investment portfolio that would ensure my financial security for life. I had worked for everything I owned, building my career from the ground up after putting myself through Northwestern University on academic scholarships. My parents had immigrated from Taiwan when I was 5 years old, and they had instilled in me the value of education and hard work. My father worked double shifts at a manufacturing plant while my mother cleaned office buildings at night. Also, they could afford to live in a good school district. They never had much money, but they gave me something more valuable than wealth, the drive to succeed, and the knowledge that I was capable of anything I set my mind to. By the time I graduated summa cum laude with my master's in accounting, I had already been recruited by 3 of Chicago's top firms. I met David Morrison at a charity auction for the Chicago Children's Hospital. I was there representing my firm, which had donated a pro bono financial audit as one of the auction items. David was there with his parents, who were major donors, to the hospital. He was tall and lean with sandy brown hair and warm hazel eyes that crinkled when he smiled. Unlike many of the men I had dated, David seemed genuinely interested in my work rather than intimidated by my success. David worked as a pediatric physical therapist at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, and his passion for helping children recover from injuries and disabilities was immediately apparent. He had a gentle way with kids that made even the most reluctant patients eager to work with him. When he talked about his work, his entire face lit up, and I found myself drawn to his compassion and dedication. He wasn't wealthy like some of the other men at the auction, but he had something more valuable, a genuine desire to make the world a better place. Our first date was at a small Italian restaurant in Little Italy, far from the upscale establishments where I usually conducted business dinners. David had chosen it because, as he explained, they had the best tiramisu in the city, and he wanted to share it with me. We talked for hours about our work, our dreams, and our families. He told me about growing up in Evanston, about his younger sister Sarah, who was studying to be a teacher, and about his parents who had been married for 35 years. What struck me most about David was his authenticity. In my world of corporate politics and calculated conversations, he was refreshingly genuine. He didn't try to impress me with expensive wines or name-drop important clients. Instead, he told me funny stories about his young patients, asked thoughtful questions about my work, and listened with genuine interest when I explained the intricacies of forensic accounting, By the end of the evening, I knew I wanted to see him again. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally over the following months. David would bring me coffee during my late nights at the office, and I would attend his hospital's fundraising events. He introduced me to hiking in the forest preserves around Chicago, while I showed him the city's best restaurants and cultural events. Despite our different backgrounds and career paths, we complemented each other perfectly. Where I was driven and intense, he was calm and grounding. Where he was trusting and optimistic, I was cautious and analytical. The first time David brought me home to meet his parents, I should have paid more attention to the warning signs. The Morrison family lived in a sprawling colonial house in Winnetka, one of Chicago's wealthiest suburbs. The house had been in David's family for 3 generations, and every room was filled with antiques, family photographs, and expensive artwork. It was beautiful, but it felt more like a museum than a home. David's father, Robert Morrison, was a retired investment banker who spent his days playing golf at the country club and managing the family's substantial portfolio. He was polite but distant during our introduction, asking perfunctory questions about my work before excusing himself to watch the news. David's mother, Patricia, was a different story entirely. She was an elegant woman in her early 60s with perfectly styled silver hair and an extensive collection of pearls. She had been a socialite since marrying Robert, dedicating her time to various charitable organizations and maintaining the family's position in Chicago's social hierarchy. From the moment I walked through their front door, Patricia made it clear that I was not what she had envisioned for her son. Her smile was cold and calculating as she looked me up and down, taking in my simple black dress and understated jewelry. "So you're the accountant David has been telling us about," she said, making my profession sound like something distasteful. "How interesting. I don't think we've ever had a working woman in the family before." The dinner conversation was peppered with subtle digs and backhanded compliments. Patricia would ask about my parents' little business, even though I had clearly explained that my father worked in manufacturing and my mother had been a cleaner. She made comments about how exotic my background was and how refreshing it must be for David to date someone so different. When I mentioned that I had bought my own apartment, she raised an eyebrow and said, "How independent of you. I suppose modern women feel they need to prove themselves in ways we never did." David seemed oblivious to his mother's passive-aggressive comments, or perhaps he had grown so accustomed to her behavior that he no longer noticed it. When I brought it up later, he brushed off my concerns, saying that his mother was just old-fashioned and needed time to get used to me. "She'll come around," he assured me. "She's protective of the family, but once she gets to know you, she'll love you as much as I do." I wanted to believe him, especially when he told me he loved me for the first time that night. We were sitting on the lakefront near my apartment, watching the city lights reflect on the water, and his words felt like a promise of the future we could build together. I had never been in love before, having always prioritized my career over relationships, but with David everything felt different. He made me want things I had never considered: a real home, children, a life that extended beyond the walls of my office. As our relationship deepened, I began to notice more troubling patterns in David's family dynamics. Patricia had an opinion about everything David did, from his choice of apartment to his work schedule to the clothes he wore. She would call him multiple times a day, often interrupting our dates or quiet evenings together. David always answered, listening patiently as she updated him on neighborhood gossip or complained about some minor inconvenience in her life. What bothered me most was how Patricia spoke about other women in David's life. She would make cutting remarks about his female colleagues, question the motives of his friends' wives, and constantly compare me unfavorably to his ex-girlfriend Amanda, who had been from a good family and would have been perfect for him if she hadn't moved to California for her career. The message was clear. No woman would ever be good enough for her precious son, but some were more inadequate than others. Despite these red flags, my love for David continued to grow. He was kind, funny, and completely devoted to me. He supported my career ambitions, celebrated my professional victories, and never made me feel guilty for working late or traveling for business. When I was stressed about a particularly challenging case, he would show up at my office with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and sit with me while I worked through financial documents. When I landed a major client that would secure my partnership track, he took me out to celebrate and told everyone we met that night about my achievement. David proposed to me on a Saturday morning in Lincoln Park Zoo, in front of the Penguin exhibit where we had shared our first kiss a year earlier. It was simple and perfect. Just him, me, and a beautiful vintage engagement ring that had belonged to his grandmother. I said yes without hesitation, knowing that despite his family's reservations, David was the man I wanted to spend my life with. The engagement period revealed even more about Patricia's true nature. She immediately took control of the wedding planning, dismissing my ideas and preferences in favor of her own vision of what a Morrison family wedding should look like. When I suggested we have the ceremony at the Art Institute of Chicago, she laughed and said that would be too ethnic for their social circle. When I showed her pictures of simple, elegant dresses I liked, she steered me toward elaborate gowns that would photograph well for the society pages. The guest list became a particular point of contention. Patricia wanted to invite 300 people, most of whom I had never met, to what I had envisioned as an intimate celebration of our love. She argued that the Morrison family had social obligations and that our wedding was an opportunity to strengthen important relationships. When I protested that I wanted my college friends and colleagues there, she sighed dramatically and said we could fit in a few of your people, if necessary. The final straw came when Patricia announced that she had booked the reception at the Chicago Yacht Club without consulting me. When I expressed my frustration to David, he once again took his mother's side, explaining that the venue was traditional for Morrison family events and that I should be honored to be included in their legacy. That was the first time we had a serious fight, and it ended with David accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful for everything his family was doing for our wedding. I realized then that David's loyalty would always be divided between his wife and his mother, and that Patricia would never accept me as an equal member of their family. But I was already too deeply in love to walk away, and I convinced myself that things would improve once we were married and I could prove my worth as David's wife. The wedding was everything Patricia wanted and nothing I had dreamed of. It was held at St. Bartholomew's Episcopal Church in Kenilworth, followed by a reception at the Yacht Club overlooking Lake Michigan. I wore a dress Patricia had chosen, a yama'i, traditional ball gown with a cathedral-length train that cost more than my first car. The ceremony was beautiful, and seeing David's face as I walked down the aisle made all the compromise and frustration worthwhile. But even on our wedding day, Patricia couldn't resist making subtle digs. During the mother-son dance, she whispered something in David's ear that made him glance over at me with a troubled expression. Later, during her toast, she welcomed me to the family while making it clear that I was joining their legacy rather than creating a new one with David. "Jessica is certainly a determined young woman," she said, raising her champagne glass. "I'm sure she'll learn to appreciate the Morrison family traditions and values as she settles into her new role as David's wife." The honeymoon in Tuscany was perfect, and for 2 weeks, it was just David and me exploring medieval towns, tasting wine, and planning our future together. David talked about the children we would have, the home we would create, and the life we would build together. He was romantic and attentive, and I began to believe that distance from his mother's influence would allow our marriage to flourish. We returned to Chicago and moved into a beautiful townhouse in Lincoln Park that we had purchased together. I had contributed more than half of the down payment, but David's name was also on the deed, and we both considered it our fresh start. The house needed work, and we spent weekends painting rooms, shopping for furniture, and creating a space that reflected both of our personalities. For the first few months of marriage, we were happy. David had encouraged me to continue my career, and I had recently been promoted to senior manager with a significant salary increase. We settled into a comfortable routine of work, date nights, and lazy weekend mornings reading the paper together. David would cook breakfast while I reviewed case files, and we would plan our weeks while sharing coffee and pastries from the French bakery down the street. The problems began when Patricia started dropping by unannounced. She would let herself in with the spare key David had given her, claiming she was just checking on the newlyweds or bringing us some family heirloom she thought we needed. She would rearrange items in our home, criticize my decorating choices, and make suggestions about how I could be a better wife to her son. One afternoon, I came home from work to find Patricia in our kitchen, reorganizing my spice cabinet. "I noticed you had paprika next to the oregano," she said without looking up. "That's not how we organize spices in our family. Let me show you the proper way." She proceeded to rearrange everything according to her preferences, ignoring my protests that I had my own system. When David arrived home an hour later, he found me in tears of frustration. Instead of supporting me, he suggested that I was overreacting and that his mother was just trying to be helpful. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "She's been running households for 40 years, he said. "Maybe you could learn something from her experience." That night was the first time I seriously considered whether I had made a mistake in marrying into the Morrison family. The situation escalated when Patricia began making comments about my work schedule and my priorities as a married woman. She would call David at work to complain that I wasn't home when she stopped by, or that our house didn't look properly maintained, because I was spending too much time at the office. She started making suggestions about how I could better support David by reducing my work hours and focusing more on domestic responsibilities. The most infuriating part was that David began to echo his mother's concerns. He would come home from their weekly lunches filled with new ideas about how our marriage could be improved. Maybe I could work fewer hours so we could spend more time together. Maybe I could take a cooking class so I could prepare the kind of meals his mother made for his father. Maybe I could join Patricia's book club or charity committee so I could better integrate into his social circle. Each suggestion felt like a small betrayal, a sign that David was more committed to maintaining his mother's approval than supporting his wife's independence. I began to feel like I was fighting a battle on two fronts, trying to excel in my demanding career while also trying to meet the impossible standards Patricia had set for her son's wife. The tension came to a head 6 months after our wedding, when Patricia announced that she expected us to attend the Morrison family's annual Christmas gathering at their country club. It was a formal affair that required me to take 2 days off work during our firm's busiest season. When I explained that I couldn't attend because I was in the middle of a major audit that could make my career, Patricia's mask of politeness finally slipped. "I see," she said, her voice cold with fury. "So your little job is more important than family obligations. I suppose we shouldn't be surprised. People from your background have different priorities than we do." The racist undertone of her comment was unmistakable, and I felt my face flush with anger and humiliation. David, who had witnessed the entire exchange, said nothing. He didn't defend me, didn't challenge his mother's obvious prejudice, didn't even acknowledge that what she had said was completely inappropriate. His silence was more painful than Patricia's words because it confirmed what I had been afraid to admit. When forced to choose between his wife and his mother, David would always choose his mother. That night, I confronted David about his failure to support me. We had our biggest fight yet, with voices raised and tears shed. David accused me of being too sensitive and unwilling to compromise. He said his mother was just set in her ways, and that I needed to be more understanding of her generation's values. When I pointed out that her values included racism and a complete disregard for my career, he accused me of looking for problems where none existed. The fight ended with David sleeping in the guest room and me lying awake wondering if our marriage was already over after just 6 months. I loved David deeply, but I was beginning to realize that he came with baggage I might not be able to handle. His relationship with his mother was unhealthy and codependent, and he seemed incapable of setting boundaries or standing up for his wife. Despite our problems, I continued to hold on to hope that things would improve. David and I went to couples counseling, where we learned communication techniques and worked on setting boundaries with extended family. David seemed to make progress, occasionally pushing back against his mother's more unreasonable demands. When Patricia complained about my work schedule, he would remind her that my career was important to both of us. When she criticized my housekeeping, he would point out that we were both busy professionals who could afford to hire help if needed. For a few months, it seemed like we were finding our balance. David was more supportive of my career ambitions, and I made an effort to be more involved in his family's activities when my schedule allowed. We started talking about our future again, making plans for the home improvements we wanted to make, and the trips we wanted to take. Most importantly, we began discussing the possibility of starting a family. I had always wanted children, but my career had been my primary focus throughout my 20s. Now, at 32 and financially secure, I felt ready to take on the challenge of balancing motherhood with my professional ambitions. David was even more enthusiastic about the prospect of becoming a father, sharing stories about his young patients and talking about the kind of parent he wanted to be. We decided to start trying for a baby after our first wedding anniversary. I went off birth control and began taking prenatal vitamins, while David started researching everything, from car seats to college savings plans. We were both excited about the possibility of creating a new life together and building the family we had always dreamed of. The irony was not lost on me that Patricia was thrilled about our decision to start trying for a baby. For the first time since I had known her, she was genuinely warm and supportive, offering advice about pregnancy and sharing stories about her own experience as a young mother. She even apologized for some of her previous behavior, explaining that she had been protective of David, but was now ready to welcome me fully into the family. I wanted to believe that this marked a turning point in our relationship, that becoming a mother would finally earn me the acceptance and respect I had been seeking. Patricia began including me in family traditions I had previously been excluded from, inviting me to lunch with her friends and seeking my opinion on family matters. For the first time since my wedding, I felt like I might actually become a real member of the Morrison family. When I missed my period in February, I was cautiously optimistic. David and I had been trying for 3 months, and while I knew it could take time, I couldn't help but hope that this was our moment. I took a pregnancy test on a Saturday morning while David was at his regular basketball game with college friends, wanting to be sure before I shared the news with him. The 2 pink lines appeared immediately, clear and unmistakable. I was pregnant. I sat on the bathroom floor staring at the test, overwhelmed by a mixture of joy, excitement, and terror. This was what we had been hoping for, but the reality of becoming a mother suddenly felt enormous and life-changing in ways I hadn't fully considered. I spent the morning planning how to tell David, settling on a romantic dinner at home with his favorite meal and a tiny pair of baby shoes I had secretly purchased weeks earlier. When he came home from basketball, sweaty and happy, I could barely contain my excitement. "I have a surprise for you," I said, leading him to the dining room where I had set the table with candles and flowers. David's reaction was everything I had hoped for and more. When he saw the baby shoes next to his plate, his face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and finally, pure joy. He swept me into his arms, spinning me around the kitchen while we both laughed and cried. "We're having a baby?" he kept saying, as if he couldn't quite believe it was real. We spent the evening making plans and dreaming about our future child. David immediately started talking about converting the spare bedroom into a nursery, while I began calculating how much maternity leave I could afford to take. We were both giddy with excitement, staying up until midnight discussing names and debating whether we wanted to find out the baby's gender in advance. The next morning, David insisted on calling his parents to share the news. I would have preferred to wait until after the first trimester, when the risk of miscarriage decreased significantly, but David was too excited to keep the secret. When Patricia answered the phone, I could hear her delighted scream from across the room. She immediately started planning a celebration dinner and talking about all the things she wanted to buy for her first grandchild. For the first time in our relationship, Patricia and I were completely aligned. She called daily to check on my symptoms, sent me articles about pregnancy nutrition, and offered to accompany me to my first prenatal appointment. The acceptance I had been craving for over a year was finally within reach, all because I was carrying her son's child. My first prenatal appointment was scheduled for 8 weeks, and David took the morning off work to come with me. We were both nervous and excited as we sat in the waiting room, holding hands and watching other couples at various stages of pregnancy. When our names were called, we followed the nurse into the examination room with anticipation building. Dr. Rodriguez was warm and professional, asking about my medical history and explaining what we could expect during the appointment. She performed a routine physical examination before setting up the ultrasound machine. "This is the moment you've been waiting for," she said with a smile. "Let's take a look at your baby." The ultrasound gel was cold against my skin as Dr. Rodriguez moved the wand across my abdomen, searching for the tiny life growing inside me. David squeezed my hand as we both stared at the monitor, waiting to see our child for the first time. But instead of the steady rhythm of a heartbeat, there was only silence. Dr. Rodriguez's expression grew concerned as she adjusted the machine and tried different angles. "I'm not detecting a fetal heartbeat," she said gently. "This sometimes happens when the pregnancy is earlier than we calculated, but I want to do a more thorough examination." She switched to a transvaginal ultrasound, which was uncomfortable but would provide a clearer picture. The minutes stretched endlessly as Dr. Rodriguez examined the images on her screen. Finally, she turned to us with the compassionate expression that medical professionals reserve for delivering devastating news. "I'm very sorry," she said softly. "The pregnancy is not viable. You've experienced what we call a missed miscarriage, where the embryo stops developing, but your body doesn't immediately recognize the loss." The words hit me like a physical blow. David's hand went slack in mine as the reality sank in. Our baby, the child we had been planning for, dreaming about, and loving for the past month, was gone. The symptoms I had been experiencing, the nausea and fatigue I had been proudly enduring, were just my body's delayed response to a loss that had already occurred. Dr. Rodriguez explained our options for managing the miscarriage, but her words seemed to come from a great distance. I felt disconnected from my own body, as if I was watching someone else receive this devastating news. David asked practical questions about the medical procedures while I struggled to process the fact that I was no longer pregnant, that our dreams had been shattered in the space of a single ultrasound appointment. We scheduled a follow-up appointment for the following week and left the office in stunned silence. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life, with both of us lost in our own grief and neither knowing what to say. When we reached our house, David immediately called his mother to share the news, and that's when everything began to unravel. Patricia's reaction was not what either of us expected. Instead of offering comfort and support, she launched into a series of questions about what I had been doing wrong. Had I been working too many hours? Was I eating properly? Had I been exercising too strenuously? Each question felt like an accusation, implying that the miscarriage was somehow my fault. "I knew this would happen," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the phone's speaker. "I tried to warn David that you weren't taking proper care of yourself. All those late nights at the office, all that stress from your job. A woman's body can't handle that kind of pressure when she's trying to grow a baby." David should have defended me in that moment. He should have told his mother that miscarriages are common and usually not caused by anything the mother did wrong. Instead, He listened quietly as she continued her litany of accusations, occasionally making non-committal sounds that could have been agreement or simple acknowledgement. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Patricia offering increasingly hurtful theories about why I had lost the baby. Maybe I hadn't wanted it enough. Maybe my body knew I wasn't ready to be a mother. Maybe this was nature's way of protecting a child who wouldn't have received proper care from a mother too focused on her career. When David finally ended the call, I was sitting on our couch with tears streaming down my face. The loss of our baby was devastating enough, but having to endure Patricia's blame and judgment while grieving felt like a second trauma. I looked at my husband, hoping he would finally stand up for me and acknowledge how inappropriate his mother's comments had been. Instead, David sat beside me and said, "Mom's just upset about the baby. She doesn't mean to sound harsh, but she's been looking forward to being a grandmother for so long." He paused, then added the words that would haunt me for months to come. "Maybe she has a point about the stress, though. You have been working pretty intense hours lately." In that moment, I realized that David would never truly be my partner, in the way I needed him to be. Even in my darkest hour, even when I was grieving the loss of our child, he was more concerned with making excuses for his mother than supporting his wife. The betrayal was almost as painful as the miscarriage itself. The days that followed were a blur of medical appointments, work obligations I couldn't focus on, and well-meaning friends who didn't know what to say. David tried to be supportive, bringing me flowers and cooking my favorite meals, but the damage had been done. Every time he spoke to his mother, I could hear the underlying agreement with her theories about my culpability in our loss. Patricia's campaign of subtle blame continued in the weeks following the miscarriage. She would make comments about other women in the family who had carried healthy pregnancies to term, implying that they had been more careful or more devoted to their unborn children. She shared articles about the importance of reducing stress during pregnancy and mentioned friends whose daughters-in-law had quit their jobs to focus on family planning. The most painful part was that some of Patricia's criticisms echoed the doubts I was already harboring about myself. Had I been too focused on work? Should I have been more careful about my diet and exercise routine? Was my body somehow inadequate for carrying a pregnancy? The rational part of my mind knew that miscarriages were common and usually not preventable, but grief made me vulnerable to self-doubt and guilt. David's response to my emotional struggle was to suggest that we should focus on trying again as soon as my doctor cleared us for pregnancy. He seemed to view the miscarriage as a temporary setback rather than a profound loss, something we could overcome with determination and better planning. When I tried to explain that I wasn't ready to think about another pregnancy, that I needed time to grieve and heal, he accused me of dwelling on the past instead of looking toward the future. 3 months after the miscarriage, I was still struggling with depression and anxiety. My work performance was suffering, and I had lost interest in most of the activities that used to bring me joy. David was growing impatient with my inability to bounce back, and Patricia was making increasingly pointed comments about my mental state and its impact on her son's happiness. It was during this dark period that I discovered information that would change everything. I was working late one evening, trying to catch up on a case I had been neglecting, when I received an unexpected email from a colleague at another firm. Margaret Chen had been a mentor during my early career, and we had maintained a professional relationship over the years. "Jessica," her email began, "I hope you don't mind me reaching out, but I've come across some information that I think you should be aware of. Are you familiar with your mother-in-law's involvement with the Riverside Community Foundation? I've been conducting an audit of their finances, and some irregularities have come to light that involve the Morrison family. Could we meet for coffee this week to discuss this confidentially?" My hands were shaking as I typed my response, agreeing to meet Margaret the following afternoon. I had no idea what kind of irregularities she had discovered, but something told me that this information would be significant. Patricia had served on the board of the Riverside Community Foundation for over 15 years. and the family had donated substantial amounts to the organization over the years. The next day, I sat across from Margaret in a quiet corner of a downtown coffee shop, listening as she explained what her investigation had uncovered. The Riverside Community Foundation had been embezzling funds from their charity programs, using donations meant for low-income families to pay for lavish board retreats and administrative expenses. Patricia Morrison had been one of the primary architects of the scheme, using her social connections to deflect scrutiny, while she and other board members diverted hundreds of thousands of dollars to their personal use. I have documentation showing that Patricia personally benefited from at least $200,000 in misdirected funds over the past 5 years, Margaret explained, sliding a folder across the table. The scheme was sophisticated, involving multiple shell companies and falsified expense reports. She used her reputation and social standing to maintain the appearance of legitimacy while systematically stealing from families in need. As I reviewed the documents Margaret had provided, I felt a mixture of shock and vindication. Here was proof that the woman who had spent months criticizing my character and blaming me for my miscarriage was herself a criminal who had been stealing from vulnerable families. The irony was not lost on me that Patricia, who had questioned my values and priorities, had been enriching herself at the expense of children and families who depended on charitable assistance. "What are you planning to do with this information?" I asked Margaret, still processing the magnitude of what she had discovered. "The foundation will be reporting it to the authorities within the next few weeks," she replied. "Criminal charges are almost certain, and there will likely be significant media attention given the prominent families involved. I thought you should know before it becomes public knowledge, given your family connection." I thanked Margaret for her discretion and professionalism, promising to keep the information confidential until the official announcement was made. As I walked back to my office, my mind was racing with the implications of what I had learned. Patricia Morrison, the woman who had made my life miserable and blamed me for losing my baby, was about to face public disgrace and criminal prosecution for her own moral failures. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of clarity about my situation. Patricia's treatment of me had never been about my worthiness as a daughter-in-law or my adequacy as a potential mother. It had been about her need to control and diminish others to maintain her own sense of superiority. The woman who had lectured me about values and family obligations had been stealing from charity while pretending to be a pillar of the community. That evening, I made copies of all the documents Margaret had provided and secured them in a safety deposit box at my bank. I also created digital copies that I stored in an encrypted folder on my personal computer. I wasn't sure how or when I would use this information, but I knew that having it gave me power in a relationship where I had felt powerless for too long. David noticed the change in my demeanor immediately. For the first time since the miscarriage, I seemed to have energy and focus. When he asked what had prompted the improvement, I simply said that I was starting to feel more like myself again. It wasn't entirely a lie. Discovering Patricia's secrets had reminded me of my own strength and professional capabilities. Over. The following weeks, I watched Patricia with new eyes as she continued her subtle campaign of criticism and manipulation. Every condescending comment, every implication that I was somehow inadequate, every suggestion that I needed to change my priorities to be worthy of her family's acceptance, all of it took on a different meaning now that I knew who she really was. The most surreal moments came when Patricia would make comments about integrity and family values, seemingly oblivious to the fact that her own criminal behavior was about to be exposed. She would criticize other people's moral failings while planning her next charity board meeting, where she would continue the facade of community service while covering up her theft from the families she claimed to help. I began to document everything. Every phone call where Patricia blamed me for the miscarriage, every family gathering where she made veiled comments about my inadequacy, every conversation where David failed to defend me or support me against his mother's attacks. I wasn't sure what I was building toward, but my forensic accounting training had taught me the value of thorough documentation. The breaking point came at David's birthday dinner in early June. Patricia had organized a family celebration at her country club, and I had reluctantly agreed to attend, despite my growing resentment of these gatherings. The evening started well. Enough, with conversation focusing on David's work and our summer travel plans. But as the wine flowed and Patricia became more comfortable, she began making increasingly pointed comments about our future family plans. She questioned whether we were really ready to try for another baby, given how poorly I had handled the first pregnancy. She suggested that perhaps we should wait until I had learned to better manage my stress levels and prioritize my health over my career. The final straw came when Patricia announced to the entire table that she thought I should consider taking a leave of absence from work to focus on my emotional recovery and preparation for motherhood. According to her, my inability to carry a pregnancy to term was clearly related to my career ambitions, and continuing to work at my current pace would only lead to more disappointment and heartbreak. David's response was the most painful part of the evening. Instead of defending me or challenging his mother's assumptions, he nodded thoughtfully and said, "That's actually not a bad idea." Mom David's agreement with his mother's suggestion about me taking a leave of absence hit me like a physical blow. I sat there in stunned silence as the conversation continued around me, with Patricia elaborating on her theory that career-focused women were fundamentally unsuited for motherhood. She cited articles she claimed to have read about the negative effects of workplace stress on fertility, conveniently ignoring the fact that millions of working women successfully carried pregnancies to term every year. The drive home was tense and silent. David seemed completely unaware that anything was wrong, humming along to the radio while I stared out the passenger window, processing the full implications of what had just happened. When we reached our townhouse, I went straight to our bedroom and began getting ready for bed, hoping to avoid the conversation I knew was coming. David followed me upstairs, settling onto the bed while I removed my jewelry and changed into pajamas. "I think Mom might be onto something about the leave of absence," he said casually, as if we were discussing weekend plans rather than the future of my career. "You've been under so much pressure lately, and maybe taking some time off would help you heal emotionally from the miscarriage." I turned to face him, searching his expression for any sign that he understood how devastating his mother's public criticism had been. "David, do you realize what your mother just did? She essentially told your entire family that I'm incapable of being a good mother because I have a career. She blamed me for losing our baby in front of everyone we know." David's face showed genuine confusion, as if he couldn't understand why I was upset. "She didn't blame you, Jess. She's just worried about your health and wants what's best for our future children. Maybe if you weren't so defensive about everything Mom says, you'd see that she's actually trying to help." The word defensive was particularly stinging because it implied that my hurt feelings were unreasonable rather than a natural response to months of criticism and blame. I tried to explain how Patricia's comments made me feel, but David consistently minimized my concerns or reframed them as misunderstandings. According to him, his mother was just old-fashioned, protective, and concerned about my well-being. That night marked a turning point in our marriage. I realized that David would never see his mother's behavior as problematic because acknowledging her cruelty would require him to confront the unhealthy dynamics he had been raised in. It was easier for him to believe that I was oversensitive than to admit that his mother was deliberately undermining his wife. Over the following weeks, Patricia's behavior became even more intrusive and controlling. She began calling David at work daily, often during important meetings, to discuss my progress in dealing with the miscarriage. She would share updates from her friends whose daughters-in-law had successfully navigated pregnancy and childbirth, always with the implication that these women had done things differently than I had. The most painful part was how Patricia began to exclude me from family activities while pretending it was for my own good. When David's sister Sarah announced her engagement, Patricia organized a family celebration dinner, but suggested that I might be too emotionally fragile to attend such a joyful event so soon after our loss. When David's cousin graduated from medical school, Patricia planned a congratulatory lunch, but worried that being around successful young women might be triggering for me. Each exclusion was presented as thoughtful consideration for my mental health, but the message was clear. I was damaged goods who couldn't be trusted to behave appropriately in family settings. David accepted these exclusions without question, often agreeing that I needed more time to heal before resuming normal social activities. Meanwhile, Patricia began inserting herself into our personal life in ways that would have been unthinkable before the miscarriage. She started showing up at our house unannounced during my lunch breaks, claiming she wanted to check on my emotional state. She would walk through our home making observations about my housekeeping, the state of our refrigerator, and whether I was taking proper care of David during this difficult time. One afternoon, I came home from work to find Patricia in our bedroom, going through my dresser drawers. When I asked what she was doing, she explained that she was looking for the maternity clothes she had given me during my pregnancy, wanting to return them to the store for a refund. The violation of privacy was stunning, but when I confronted David about it later, he said his mother was just being practical and trying to spare me the pain of seeing reminders of our lost pregnancy. Patricia also began monitoring my work schedule with an intensity that bordered on surveillance. She would call our house at random times during the day, claiming she wanted to chat but actually checking whether I was home or at the office. If I didn't answer, she would call David to express concern that I was working too many hours and not taking proper care of myself. The scrutiny extended to my diet and exercise habits as well. Patricia would arrive at our house with groceries, explaining that she wanted to make sure I was eating foods that would support my fertility and emotional recovery. She criticized my coffee consumption, questioned my vitamin regimen, and suggested that I replace my evening runs with gentler activities like yoga or meditation. Every aspect of my life became subject to Patricia's judgment and interference. She questioned my choice of clothing, suggesting that I dressed too professionally and needed to embrace a more nurturing, feminine aesthetic. She criticized my hair and makeup, implying that my appearance reflected my inner emotional state, and that looking too polished suggested I wasn't properly grieving our lost child. The constant criticism began to erode my confidence in ways I hadn't anticipated. I found myself second-guessing decisions I would have made instinctively before the miscarriage, wondering if Patricia might be right about my inadequacies as a potential mother. Her voice seemed to echo in my head during client meetings, social gatherings, and quiet moments at home. David's response to my growing distress was to suggest that I was being too sensitive and needed to develop thicker skin. He pointed out that his mother had raised 3 successful children and had decades of experience with family matters, implying that her guidance should be valued rather than resented. When I tried to explain how her constant criticism was affecting my mental health, he suggested that I might benefit from therapy to work through my issues with his family. The therapy suggestion was particularly galling because it framed my legitimate concerns as psychological problems that needed professional treatment. According to David's logic, the issue wasn't his mother's behavior, but my inability to accept her well-intentioned advice and support. He even offered to help me find a therapist who specialized in grief counseling and family dynamics. I did eventually start seeing a therapist, but not for the reasons David had suggested. Dr. Sarah Kim was a licensed clinical social worker who specialized in family systems and boundary issues. During our sessions, she helped me understand that I was experiencing emotional abuse disguised as concern and support. Dr. Kim explained that Patricia's behavior followed classic patterns of manipulation and control. By framing her criticism as worry for my well-being, Patricia could attack my character and choices while maintaining plausible deniability about her motives. By involving David in her campaign against me, she ensured that her son would remain loyal to her rather than supporting his wife. The therapy sessions were both validating and heartbreaking. For the first time in months, I had someone acknowledge that my feelings were reasonable and that Patricia's behavior was indeed inappropriate. But Dr. Kim also helped me understand that changing the dynamic would require David to recognize the problem and set boundaries with his mother, something he seemed completely unwilling to do. As summer progressed, Patricia's interference reached new levels of audacity. She began making appointments for me without my knowledge or consent, scheduling everything from hair appointments to doctor visits that she thought would benefit my emotional recovery. When I missed a massage appointment she had booked for me, she called David at work to complain that I was being ungrateful and resistant to help. The breaking point came when Patricia scheduled a consultation with a fertility specialist without telling me. She had somehow obtained my medical records from my regular doctor and had arranged for Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a reproductive endocrinologist, to review my case and provide recommendations for future pregnancies. When the appointment reminder came in the mail, I realized that Patricia had been far more involved in my medical care than I had ever authorized. I called Dr. Walsh's office immediately to cancel the appointment and demand an explanation for how they had obtained my personal medical information. The receptionist explained that Mrs. Morrison had presented herself as my mother-in-law and expressed concern about my fertility issues following a recent miscarriage. She had provided enough personal information to convince the office staff that she was acting with my knowledge and consent. The violation was so extreme that I considered filing a formal complaint about the breach of my medical privacy. Patricia had essentially impersonated me to gain access to confidential health information, then used that information to schedule medical appointments I had never requested. When I confronted David about his mother's behavior, he initially tried to defend her actions as well-intentioned before finally admitting that she had overstepped boundaries. But even David's acknowledgement that his mother had gone too far didn't translate into any meaningful action. When I demanded that he confront Patricia about her unauthorized access to my medical records, he suggested that we handle the situation delicately to avoid creating family drama. According to David, his mother's heart was in the right place, even if her methods were misguided. The conversation that followed was one of the most frustrating of our marriage. David seemed incapable of understanding that Patricia's good intentions didn't excuse her manipulative and invasive behavior. He consistently minimized the severity of her actions, while emphasizing my responsibility to be more understanding and forgiving. When I pointed out that no reasonable person would consider accessing someone else's medical records without permission to be acceptable behavior, David accused me of being vindictive and holding grudges. He suggested that I was looking for reasons to dislike his mother rather than appreciating her efforts to help us through a difficult time. The gaslighting was so complete that I began to question my own perception of events. Was I being unreasonable in expecting basic privacy and respect? Was Patricia's behavior really as problematic as it seemed? Or was I allowing my grief and stress to distort my judgment? David's consistent defense of his mother made me wonder if I was the problem in our family dynamic. Dr. Kim helped me understand that this self-doubt was a common response to emotional manipulation. Patricia and David had created a narrative in which my reactions were the problem, not the behaviors that prompted those reactions. By constantly questioning my perceptions and feelings, they had succeeded in making me doubt my own reality. The summer ended with a family vacation to the Morrison family cottage in Michigan that I had been dreading for weeks. Patricia had planned the entire trip without consulting me, booking accommodations and activities based on her assumptions about what would be therapeutic for me following the miscarriage. The cottage was beautiful, situated on a pristine lake surrounded by towering pine trees, but I knew that spending a week in close quarters with Patricia would be emotionally exhausting. The vacation began badly when I discovered that Patricia had arranged the sleeping accommodations to suit her own preferences rather than consulting David and me about our needs. She had given us the smallest bedroom in the cottage, claiming that the larger rooms were needed for families with children. Since we had no children to accommodate, she reasoned, we should be content with less space. The slight might have seemed minor to an outside observer, but it was emblematic of how Patricia consistently treated David and me as less important than other family members. Every decision she made reinforced the hierarchy she had established, with herself at the top and me at the bottom. The week was filled with activities that Patricia had chosen based on her vision of what would help me heal from the miscarriage. We visited a local art gallery where she encouraged me to purchase paintings that depicted mother and child themes, suggesting that surrounding myself with images of successful motherhood would inspire positive thoughts about future pregnancies. We spent an afternoon at a farmer's market where Patricia introduced me to several vendors as her daughter-in-law, who was going through a difficult time, but was learning to focus on the important things in life. The public nature of these introductions was humiliating, but Patricia seemed to enjoy the sympathetic responses she received from strangers who viewed her as a caring mother-in-law supporting her troubled daughter-in-law. The most painful part of the vacation was watching how differently Patricia treated David's sister Sarah and her new fiancé. Sarah was included in all decision-making, consulted about meal planning, and given the best bedroom in the cottage. Her opinions were sought and valued, her preferences accommodated, and her relationship celebrated. The contrast was stark and obviously intentional. Patricia wanted me to see how family members were treated when they met her standards for acceptability. Sarah had chosen a fiancé from an appropriate social background, had never challenged family traditions, and had always deferred to Patricia's authority. Her reward was inclusion, respect, and genuine affection. I, on the other hand, had committed the unforgivable sins of being successful in my own right, having opinions that differed from Patricia's, and expecting to be treated as an equal in family discussions. My punishment was a campaign of subtle humiliation, designed to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. The vacation also revealed new information about the Morrison family's financial situation that would prove relevant to the secrets I was already keeping. During a conversation about home renovations, Robert casually mentioned that they were considering selling some property to fund Patricia's latest charity project. The comment was brief and easily overlooked, but my forensic accounting training made me pay attention to any discussion of asset liquidation. Later that evening, I overheard Patricia on the phone with someone discussing the need to restructure some investments before the end of the year. The conversation was vague, but combined with Robert's earlier comment about selling property, it suggested that the Morrison family's finances might not be as stable as they appeared. The information was interesting, but not immediately actionable. I filed it away in my mental database of potentially relevant facts, along with everything else I had been observing about the family's dynamics and decision-making processes. My training had taught me that patterns often emerged from seemingly unrelated pieces of information, and I was beginning to see concerning patterns in the Morrison family's behavior. The vacation ended with what Patricia presented as a heartfelt conversation about my future with the family. She had arranged for us to have coffee together on the cottage's screened porch, while David and his father went fishing, creating what she called an opportunity for woman-to-woman honesty. Patricia began by acknowledging that our relationship had been challenging and expressing her desire to start fresh. She claimed to understand that losing the baby had been traumatic for me, and that her attempts to help might have been misinterpreted as criticism. According to her narrative, we had both made mistakes in our communication, and it was time to move forward with better understanding. The conversation felt like a carefully rehearsed performance designed to make Patricia appear reasonable and conciliatory while subtly reinforcing her authority over me. She spoke about her hopes for our future relationship, her excitement about becoming a grandmother, and her willingness to be more patient as I learned to navigate the complexities of being part of their family. But beneath the surface kindness, the conversation was filled with conditional statements and implied expectations. Patricia would be more supportive if I was more receptive to guidance. She would be more inclusive if I was more appreciative of family traditions. She would be more understanding if I was more willing to prioritize family over career. The message was clear. Acceptance into the Morrison family came with a price, and that price was my independence and autonomy. Patricia was offering me a place in her world, but only if I was willing to diminish myself to fit the role she had defined for me. I listened to Patricia's monologue with growing clarity about the choice I was facing. I could continue trying to earn acceptance from a woman who would never truly respect me, or I could find the courage to reject a relationship built on inequality and manipulation. The decision was becoming clearer with every passing day. The drive home from Michigan was subdued, with David commenting on how well the vacation had gone and how much better his mother and I seemed to be getting along. He was pleased that we had finally had an honest conversation and hopeful that our relationship would improve going forward. I didn't share David's optimism, but I also didn't try to explain why Patricia's apparent olive branch felt more like another form of manipulation. David heard what he wanted to hear in his mother's words, and nothing I said would change his interpretation of the conversation. Back in Chicago, I threw myself into work with renewed intensity. The distraction of challenging cases and demanding clients was a welcome relief from the emotional exhaustion of family dynamics. My colleagues noticed the change in my energy level and commented on my improved focus and productivity. But even at work, I couldn't completely escape Patricia's influence. She had begun calling my office occasionally, ostensibly to check on my well-being, but actually to monitor my work schedule and professional commitments. She would ask my assistant about my travel plans, my office hours, and whether I seemed stressed or overwhelmed. The calls were another violation of boundaries, but they were so subtle and seemingly well-intentioned that complaining about them would have made me appear paranoid or ungrateful. Patricia had perfected the art of intrusion disguised as caring, making it nearly impossible to object to her behavior without seeming unreasonable. As autumn arrived, Patricia began planning the family's holiday celebrations with her typical attention to detail and complete disregard for anyone else's preferences. She had decided that Thanksgiving would be held at our house, explaining that hosting the family gathering would be good for my emotional recovery and help me feel more connected to family traditions. The decision was presented as a generous gesture, but I understood it for what it really was. Another test of my willingness to conform to Patricia's expectations. She wanted to see if I would graciously accept the burden of hosting 25 people for a formal dinner, or if I would resist and confirm her suspicions about my inadequacy as a daughter-in-law. When I expressed concerns about hosting such a large gathering while managing my demanding work schedule, Patricia offered to help with the planning and preparation. Her assistance came with detailed instructions about menu choices, table settings, and appropriate attire for the occasion. Every suggestion reinforced her vision of how the event should be conducted and my role as hostess. The Thanksgiving preparation became a month-long ordeal that consumed my evenings and weekends. Patricia visited our house multiple times each week to inspect my progress, offering corrections and improvements to everything from the centerpiece arrangements to the guest bedroom preparations. Nothing I did met her standards without modification, and every interaction reinforced her authority over the event. David was no help during this period, claiming that his mother's involvement was a blessing that would ensure the dinner's success. He seemed genuinely puzzled by my stress and frustration, unable to understand why I wasn't grateful for Patricia's expertise and assistance. The disconnect between David's perception of his mother's help and my experience of her control was becoming unbridgeable. We were living in the same reality but interpreting events through completely different frameworks. David saw loving support where I saw manipulation and dominance. 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, I made a discovery that changed everything. While reviewing financial documents for a client case, I recognized a corporate name that Patricia had mentioned during one of her phone conversations at the cottage. Morrison Holdings LLC was listed as a major creditor in the bankruptcy filing I was reviewing, having lost nearly $500,000 in a failed real estate development project. The connection was too significant to ignore. I spent my lunch break researching Morrison Holdings LLC and discovered that it was indeed connected to David's family, serving as the umbrella company for several of their investment properties and business ventures. According to public records, the company had been involved in multiple failed projects over the past 2 years and was facing significant financial difficulties. The information painted a very different picture of the Morrison family's wealth and stability than what they presented to the world. Combined with the conversations I had overheard about asset restructuring and property sales, it appeared that the family was experiencing serious financial problems while maintaining the facade of prosperity. But the most shocking discovery came when I cross-referenced the Morrison Holdings bankruptcy documents with the charity embezzlement information Margaret had provided months earlier. The timeline of the Riverside Community Foundation thefts coincided perfectly with Morrison Holdings' financial difficulties, suggesting that Patricia's criminal activity might have been motivated by her family's need for money rather than simple greed. The revelation added new dimensions to Patricia's behavior toward me. Her criticism of my career success might have been motivated by jealousy of my financial independence. Her attempts to control my spending and lifestyle choices might have reflected anxiety about her own family's precarious financial situation. More importantly, the financial information gave me additional leverage if I ever decided to confront Patricia about her treatment of me. She was already facing criminal charges for embezzlement, and evidence of additional financial improprieties could make her legal situation even more serious. As Thanksgiving approached, I felt like I was living a double life. On the surface, I was the dutiful daughter-in-law preparing to host her first major family gathering. Underneath, I was a forensic accountant sitting on information that could destroy the woman who had spent months trying to destroy me. The duality was exhausting, but also empowering. For the first time since my miscarriage, I felt like I had some control over my situation. Patricia might continue her campaign of subtle humiliation and manipulation, but I knew secrets about her that she could never imagine I possessed. The knowledge didn't make Thanksgiving preparation any easier, but it did give me perspective on Patricia's behavior. Every criticism, every correction, every attempt to diminish me was coming from a woman whose own life was built on lies and criminal activity. Her moral authority was completely fraudulent, and soon the entire world would know it. 3 days before Thanksgiving, I received a call from Margaret Chen that would accelerate the timeline for everything. The Riverside Community Foundation. Investigation had been completed, and criminal charges would be filed against Patricia and 3 other board members the week after Thanksgiving. The story would likely break in the media shortly after the charges were announced. Margaret wanted to give me advance warning so I could prepare for the impact on my family. She also mentioned that additional evidence had emerged suggesting the scope of the embezzlement was even larger than initially suspected. Patricia's legal troubles were going to be far more serious than anyone had anticipated. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Thanksgiving dinner would likely be the last family gathering before Patricia's world collapsed. The irony was perfect. She had orchestrated this elaborate event to demonstrate her authority and my submission, but it would actually serve as her final performance before her true character was revealed to everyone who mattered to her. The knowledge gave me a sense of calm I hadn't felt in months. I could endure one more weekend of Patricia's manipulation and control, because I knew it would be ending soon. Justice was coming, and I wouldn't have to do anything to make it happen, except wait and watch. Thanksgiving morning arrived with the kind of crisp November weather that Patricia always claimed was perfect for family gatherings. I woke at 5:30 to begin the elaborate preparations she had outlined in her 12-page instruction manual, complete with timetables and temperature guidelines for every dish. The house smelled of sage and rosemary from the herb butter I had prepared the night before, and our dining room table gleamed under the crystal chandelier David's grandmother had given us as a wedding gift. As I moved through the familiar motions of cooking and setting up, I felt strangely detached from the entire process. This beautiful meal, this perfect presentation, this desperate attempt to meet Patricia's impossible standards, all of it would be meaningless in a few days when her carefully constructed world began to crumble. The knowledge of what was coming gave me an odd sense of peace as I arranged the last of the autumn flowers Patricia had specifically requested for the centerpieces. David padded into the kitchen around 7, already dressed in the navy blazer and khakis his mother had suggested for the occasion. He wrapped his arms around my waist from behind, nuzzling my neck as I stirred the cranberry sauce. "Everything smells incredible," he murmured. "Mom's going to be so impressed. You've really outdone yourself." The comment stung in ways I hadn't expected. Even on this morning, when I had been awake for hours executing Patricia's vision of the perfect Thanksgiving, David's primary concern was his mother's approval rather than acknowledging my effort and skill. The pattern was so deeply ingrained that he didn't even seem aware of it anymore. Our first guests arrived at 11:30, David's Uncle Richard and Aunt Catherine, followed quickly by his cousin Michael and his wife Jennifer. Patricia swept through our front door at exactly noon, resplendent in a cream-colored cashmere dress and her signature pearl necklace. She carried a large wicker basket filled with what she called finishing touches, additional serving pieces, cloth napkins she preferred to the ones I had chosen, and several bottles of wine from their private collection. Within minutes of her arrival, Patricia was rearranging items throughout the house with the confidence of someone who considered herself the true hostess of the event. She moved the floral arrangements to positions she deemed more appropriate, replaced my carefully chosen playlist with classical music she had brought on her phone, and relocated several serving dishes to create what she called better flow in the dining room. Each change was presented as a helpful suggestion, but the cumulative effect was to transform my carefully planned event into Patricia's vision of what Thanksgiving should be. David watched these modifications with obvious relief, as if his mother's involvement guaranteed the success of our gathering. He thanked her repeatedly for her contributions, seemingly oblivious to how her changes undermined my role as hostess. By the time all 25 guests had arrived, our house was buzzing with conversation and laughter. The Morrison family had a talent for creating an atmosphere of warmth and conviviality that made even the most elaborate gatherings feel relaxed and intimate. Watching them interact, I could almost understand why David found it difficult to see the darker undercurrents of his family's dynamics. Patricia was in her element, moving gracefully from group to group, ensuring that everyone felt welcomed and included. She had a remarkable ability to remember personal details about each guest's life, asking thoughtful questions about their children's activities, their travel plans, and their professional achievements. To an outside observer, she appeared to be the perfect hostess and devoted family matriarch. But I was no longer an outside observer. I watched Patricia's performance with the analytical eye of someone who understood the difference between genuine warmth and calculated charm. Every gracious gesture, every interested question, every loving touch was designed to reinforce her position at the center of the family constellation. She was conducting an orchestra, and everyone else, including me, was expected to play their assigned parts. The afternoon progressed according to Patricia's carefully orchestrated timeline. Cocktails were served at 1 o'clock, followed by appetizers at 1:30. Dinner would be served at 3, allowing time for conversation and dessert before the football games began at 6. Every detail had been planned to maximize the family's enjoyment and minimize any possibility of awkwardness or conflict. During the cocktail hour, I found myself in several conversations that revealed new information about the family's current situation. David's cousin Jennifer mentioned that her mother-in-law had been asking questions about Patricia's recent resignation from the Riverside Community Foundation Board. According to Jennifer, Patricia had cited health concerns as her reason for stepping down. But the timing had surprised many people who knew how devoted she had been to the organization. The conversation was casual and seemingly innocent, but it confirmed what I already suspected. Patricia was already positioning herself to minimize the damage from the coming scandal. By resigning from the foundation board before the criminal charges were announced, she could claim that she had left due to personal issues rather than being forced out due to criminal activity. Another revealing conversation occurred when David's Uncle Robert mentioned his concern about the real estate market and its impact on investment portfolios. He made several oblique references to challenging times, and the need for creative financial planning that suggested the Morrison family's financial difficulties were more widespread than I had initially realized. The pattern of coded language and euphemistic references painted a picture of a family that was struggling financially but determined to maintain appearances at all costs. The elaborate Thanksgiving dinner, the expensive wines, the designer clothing, all of it was part of a carefully maintained facade designed to hide the reality of their deteriorating financial situation. As we moved into the dining room for dinner, Patricia took charge of the seating arrangements with her usual attention to hierarchy and protocol. She placed herself at the head of the table, with David's father Robert at the opposite end. David and I were seated in the middle of one side, positioned so that Patricia could easily monitor our behavior and participation in the conversation. The meal itself was flawless, executed exactly according to Patricia's specifications. The turkey was perfectly golden and moist. The side dishes complemented each other beautifully, and the wine pairings she had selected enhanced every course. As a purely culinary achievement, the dinner was undeniably successful. But the emotional undercurrents of the gathering were far more complex than the harmonious surface suggested. Throughout the meal, Patricia made subtle comments that reinforced the family's understanding of my place in their hierarchy. She thanked me for my assistance with the meal preparation, as if I had been a helpful volunteer rather than the primary cook. She complimented the traditional recipes we had used, crediting herself and David's grandmother for the menu choices I had actually researched and planned. The most painful moment came during dessert, when Patricia stood to offer a toast to family traditions and the importance of preserving the values that had sustained the Morrison family for generations. Her words were beautiful and heartfelt, but they contained an implicit message about who belonged to the family's core and who remained on the periphery. She spoke about the courage of David's great-grandparents who had built their fortune through hard work and integrity. She praised the dedication of David's grandparents who had maintained the family's reputation through decades of community service. She acknowledged the accomplishments of David's generation, highlighting their professional achievements and their commitment to carrying forward the family legacy. Throughout the toast, Patricia's eyes found every family member in turn, offering each of them a moment of recognition and inclusion. When her gaze reached me, there was a brief pause, not long enough for anyone else to notice, but sufficient to communicate that my place in the family story remained conditional and uncertain. The toast concluded with Patricia's expression of gratitude for the family's health, prosperity, and unity. The irony of her words was not lost on me, given what I knew about her criminal activities and the family's financial struggles. She was offering thanks for blessings that were largely fictional, built on a foundation of deception and theft. After dinner, the family dispersed into smaller groups throughout the house. The men gathered in the living room to watch football, while the women collected in the kitchen to clean up and package leftovers. This division of labor was presented as natural and traditional, but it also served to segregate the family by gender and reinforce conventional role expectations. I found myself washing dishes alongside David's sister Sarah, his cousin Jennifer, and several of the aunts. The conversation was light and friendly, focusing on family gossip, holiday plans, and the challenges of coordinating large gatherings. Patricia moved through the kitchen offering supervision and direction, ensuring that everything was cleaned and stored according to her preferences. During a brief lull in the conversation, Sarah mentioned that she had recently started working with a financial advisor to plan for her upcoming wedding and future family expenses. The comment prompted a discussion about investment strategies and financial planning that revealed more about the family's current anxieties. Patricia steered the conversation away from specific financial details, but not before several comments were made about the volatility of current markets and the importance of diversifying assets. The subtext was clear. The Morrison family was concerned about their financial security in ways they had never been before. As the afternoon wore on, I noticed Patricia making several private phone calls, stepping onto our back patio or into our guest bathroom to conduct brief, hushed conversations. The calls seemed urgent, but discreet, and she always returned to the gathering with a bright smile and renewed engagement in family activities. My forensic accounting experience had taught me to pay attention to unusual communication patterns, especially when they occurred during family gatherings or social events. People who were managing financial or legal crises often found it difficult to completely disconnect from their problems, even during celebrations. One of Patricia's phone calls lasted longer than the others, and when she returned to the kitchen, I noticed that her composure seemed slightly strained. She immediately began fussing with the leftover arrangements, reorganizing containers and wrapping dishes with unnecessary intensity. The behavior suggested anxiety that she was working hard to conceal. Around 6 o'clock, guests began preparing to leave, gathering their coats and expressing gratitude for the wonderful meal and lovely afternoon. Patricia graciously accepted their thanks while ensuring that each family had appropriate containers of leftovers to take home. The gift-giving was another demonstration of her authority and generosity, reinforcing her position as the family's primary caretaker. As the last guest departed, Patricia lingered to oversee the final cleanup and offer her assessment of the day's success. She pronounced the gathering a complete triumph, praising my execution of her plans while making it clear that the success was due to her guidance and oversight. "You did very well today, Jessica," she said, folding the last of the cloth napkins with precision. "I think you're finally beginning to understand what these family traditions mean to us. With a little more experience, you'll be able to host events like this without quite so much assistance." The backhanded compliment was typical Patricia. Acknowledgement, wrapped in condescension, designed to make me grateful for her approval while reinforcing my dependence on her expertise. David beamed at his mother's words, clearly relieved that the day had met her standards and that I had successfully navigated another test of my worthiness. After Patricia and Robert finally left, David and I collapsed on our living room couch, exhausted but satisfied with the day's apparent success. David was euphoric about his mother's positive reaction and convinced that this marked a turning point in our relationship with his family. "I told you Mom would come around," he said, pulling me close against his side. She was really impressed with how everything turned out. "I think she's finally starting to see you the way I've always seen you, as someone who belongs in this family." His words were meant to be comforting, but they revealed how little David understood about the dynamics that had been playing out all day. He genuinely believed that Patricia's approval was something I should be grateful to receive, rather than recognizing that her conditional acceptance was itself a form of control and manipulation. I didn't have the energy to explain what I had really experienced during the gathering, or to help David understand that his mother's praise came with strings attached. Instead, I simply nodded and allowed him to believe that progress had been made in our family relationships. The next morning, I woke early and drove to my office to catch up on work that had been neglected during the Thanksgiving preparations. The building was nearly empty, creating a peaceful environment where I could focus on client cases without interruption. I had several urgent matters that required attention before the weekend, including a complex fraud investigation that was entering its final stages. As I worked through financial documents and prepared reports, my phone rang with a call from Margaret Chen. Her voice was tense and urgent, very different from her usual professional calm. "Jessica, I need to see you immediately," she said. "Something has happened with the Riverside Community Foundation case, and there are developments you need to know about before they become public. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop near my office within the hour." Margaret's request was unusual enough to make me concerned about what new information she had discovered. The timeline for the criminal charges had been moved up, or additional evidence had emerged that changed the scope of the investigation. When I arrived at the coffee shop, Margaret was already waiting in a corner booth, looking uncharacteristically anxious. She had several manila folders spread on the table, along with her laptop and what appeared to be legal documents. The situation is more serious than we initially realized, Margaret began without preamble. The FBI has taken over the investigation, and they've uncovered evidence of a much larger criminal conspiracy involving multiple charitable organizations and prominent families. She explained that Patricia's activities with the Riverside Community Foundation were part of a sophisticated network of financial crimes that had been operating for nearly a decade. The scheme involved several nonprofit organizations, multiple family foundations, and a complex web of shell companies designed to launder stolen funds. Patricia Morrison isn't just facing embezzlement charges, Margaret continued. She's looking at federal racketeering charges, money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy. The FBI believes she was one of the primary architects of the entire operation. The scope of Patricia's criminal activities was staggering. According to Margaret's information, Patricia had helped steal over $2 million from various charitable organizations over the past 8 years. The money had been used to fund lavish lifestyles, pay for luxury vacations, and cover investment losses for the families involved in the conspiracy. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Margaret opened one of her folders and pulled out a series of bank statements and financial records that made my blood run cold. The FBI has traced some of the stolen money directly to accounts controlled by Morrison Holdings, LLC, Margaret said quietly. Your husband's family has been living off stolen charity funds for years. The documents showed regular transfers from accounts associated with the embezzlement scheme to Morrison Holdings accounts, dating back to before I had even met David. The family's comfortable lifestyle, their expensive home, their ability to maintain their social status despite poor investment performance, all of it had been subsidized by money stolen from organizations meant to help vulnerable families and children. Margaret continued explaining the FBI's findings, but her words seemed to come from a great distance. I was processing the implications of what she had told me, trying to understand how this revelation would affect my life and my marriage. David had to know. There was no way his family could have been receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars in suspicious transfers without his knowledge. The mortgage payments on their Winnetka home, the country club memberships, the expensive cars, the designer, clothing, all of it had been funded by criminal activity. But even more devastating was the realization that David had allowed me to be blamed for our miscarriage, while knowing that his family's wealth was built on stealing from charity. He had listened to his mother criticize my character and question my values while being fully aware that she was a criminal who had been robbing funds meant for sick children and homeless families. The betrayal was so complete and so profound that I felt physically ill. Everything I thought I knew about my husband and his family had been a lie. The moral authority they had claimed, the values they had espoused, the judgments they had made about my worthiness, all of it had been a massive deception designed to hide their criminal enterprise. Margaret was still talking, explaining the timeline for arrests and the likely media coverage of the scandal. The FBI would be making arrests early next week, probably Tuesday or Wednesday. The story would break in the national media shortly afterward, given the prominence of the families involved and the scope of the crimes. There's one more thing you need to know, Margaret said, her voice growing even more serious. The FBI is investigating whether any of the family members who received stolen funds could face charges as well. If they can prove that David knew about the source of the money, he could be charged as an accessory after the fact. The possibility that David might face criminal charges added another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Even if I could forgive his deception about his family's criminal activities, I couldn't stand by him if he was going to be prosecuted for participating in the theft of charity funds. I thanked Margaret for the information and promised to keep everything confidential until the official announcements were made. As I walked back to my car, my mind was racing with questions about what I should do with this knowledge and how it would affect my future. The drive home was a blur of conflicting emotions and racing thoughts. By the time I pulled into our garage, I had made several important decisions about how to handle the crisis that was about to engulf my life. First, I needed to protect myself legally and financially from any fallout from David's family's criminal activities. I would need to document my lack of knowledge about their crimes and ensure that my assets were protected from any civil lawsuits or criminal penalties that might affect the Morrison family. Second, I needed to confront David about his knowledge of his family's activities and give him an opportunity to explain his role in the deception. Depending on his response, I would need to make some difficult decisions about the future of our marriage. Third, I needed to prepare for the media attention and social scrutiny that would inevitably follow the announcement of Patricia's arrest. The scandal would be front-page news in Chicago, and everyone who knew our family would be watching to see how we responded to the crisis. David was in the living room when I entered the house, watching college football and working on his laptop. He looked up with a smile when I walked in, clearly expecting me to join him for a relaxing afternoon after the success of yesterday's dinner. "How was the office?" he asked, patting the couch cushion beside him. "I can't believe you went in. On the day after Thanksgiving, you really are a workaholic." His casual tone and normal behavior suggested that he had no idea what was coming. Either David was an exceptionally good actor, or he was genuinely unaware that his family's criminal activities were about to be exposed. I sat down beside him, studying his face for any signs of anxiety or guilt. "David, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Something in my tone must have alerted him to the seriousness of the conversation, because he immediately closed his laptop and turned to face me fully. "What's wrong? You look upset." "I know about your mother's activities with the Riverside Community Foundation," I said, watching his reaction carefully. "I know about the embezzlement, the money laundering, and the transfers to Morrison Holdings. I know about all of it." David's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and finally fear. The progression confirmed what I had suspected. He knew exactly what his mother had been doing, and he understood the implications of my discovery. "Jessica, I can explain," he began, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Before you say anything else, you need to understand that the FBI is involved now. Criminal charges are being filed next week, and there's going to be a federal investigation into everyone who received money from the embezzlement scheme. This isn't just about your mother anymore. It's about your entire family." The color drained from David's face as the full scope of the situation became clear. He sat in silence for several minutes, apparently trying to process the information and formulate a response. "How long have you known?" he finally asked. "I've known about your mother's embezzlement for months," I replied. "I just learned today about the federal investigation and the money transfers to your family's accounts." David's next question revealed everything I needed to know about his character and priorities. "Are you going to turn us in?" The fact that his first concern was whether I would report his family's crimes, rather than expressing shock or remorse about their activities, told me that David had been fully aware of what was happening. He wasn't surprised by the revelation. He was only surprised that I had discovered it. "I don't need to turn you in," I said coldly. "The FBI already has all the evidence they need. The only question now is whether you're going to be charged, as an accessory or just as someone who benefited from criminal proceeds." David's carefully constructed facade finally cracked completely. He buried his face in his hands and began talking rapidly, as if confessing everything would somehow minimize his culpability. The story that emerged was even worse than I had imagined. David had known about his mother's embezzlement from the Kia beginning, having helped her set up some of the shell companies used to launder the stolen funds. He had justified his participation by convincing himself that the money was being borrowed from the charities and would eventually be repaid. The Morrison family's financial crisis had been more severe than anyone outside the immediate family realized. Poor investment decisions and failed business ventures had left them heavily in debt and facing the possibility of losing their home and social status. Patricia's theft from the charitable organizations had been presented as a temporary solution to bridge their financial difficulties. "We never intended for it to go on this long," David said, his voice muffled by his hands. "It was supposed to be short-term, just until Dad's investments recovered. But then the market kept getting worse, and we needed more money to maintain our lifestyle and keep up appearances." The rationalization was pathetic and morally bankrupt. David and his family had stolen millions of dollars from organizations that served homeless families, sick children, and other vulnerable populations, all to maintain their privileged lifestyle and social status. But the worst part of David's confession was his admission that the family had been planning to use my miscarriage as a way to deflect attention from their financial problems. According to David, Patricia had suggested that my emotional instability following the pregnancy loss would provide cover for any unusual financial activities or changes in their lifestyle. "Mom thought that if we focused attention on your struggles with the miscarriage, people would attribute any family stress to that, rather than looking deeper into our finances," David explained. "She said that having a daughter-in-law with mental health issues would actually help protect the family from scrutiny." The calculation was breathtaking in its cruelty. Patricia had deliberately intensified my grief and trauma following the miscarriage, not just out of personal malice, but as part of a strategic plan to protect her criminal enterprise. My pain had been weaponized to serve her need for cover and deflection. David continued his confession, revealing detail after detail of his family's criminal activities and moral failures. They had stolen money meant for cancer research to pay for their country club membership. They had diverted funds intended for homeless shelters to cover the cost of Patricia's designer wardrobe. They had taken money earmarked for children's educational programs to finance their luxury vacations. Every charitable cause that Patricia had publicly supported, every moral principle she had claimed to uphold, every criticism she had made of my character and values, all of it had been a massive lie designed to hide the fact that she was systematically stealing from the people she claimed to help. As David's confession continued, I realized that my marriage had been built on a foundation of deception so complete that there was no possibility of rebuilding trust or respect. David hadn't just lied to me about his family's activities. He had actively participated in using my grief and trauma to protect their criminal enterprise. When David finally finished talking, we sat in silence for several minutes. I was processing the full scope of his betrayal, while he seemed to be waiting for some sign of forgiveness or understanding. "Jessica, you have to understand that I never wanted any of this to happen," he said finally. "I love you, and I never meant for you to get hurt. We were just trying to solve our family's problems without anyone getting hurt." The attempt to minimize his actions and present himself as a victim of circumstances was the final insult. David had watched his mother blame me for our miscarriage, had allowed her to systematically undermine my confidence and mental health, and had participated in a criminal conspiracy that stole millions from charity, all while presenting himself as a loving husband who wanted to start a family with me. "Get out," I said quietly. "What?" "Get out of this house. Pack whatever you need for a few days and leave. I don't want to see you or talk to you until I've had time to process all of this." David's face crumpled as the reality of losing his marriage joined his fears about criminal prosecution. "Jessica, please don't do this. We can work through this together. I know I made mistakes, but I love you. We can get past this." The plea was desperate and pathetic, coming from a man who had just admitted to years of criminal activity and deliberate deception. David still seemed to believe that love could overcome the massive betrayal he had perpetrated against his wife and the communities his family had robbed. "You've been lying to me for our entire relationship," I said, standing up from the couch. "You've allowed your mother to abuse me emotionally while knowing that her moral authority was completely fraudulent. You've used my grief over our miscarriage to protect your family's criminal enterprise. There is no coming back from that. David made several more attempts to negotiate or postpone his departure, but I remained firm in my demand that he leave immediately. Within an hour, he had packed a suitcase and left our house, still hoping that time and distance would somehow make the situation more manageable. After David left, I poured myself a large glass of wine and sat in my living room, trying to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. My marriage was over, my husband was likely facing criminal charges, and my mother-in-law was about to become the centerpiece of a federal criminal investigation. But for the first time in months, I also felt a sense of clarity and relief. The gaslighting was over, the pretense was finished, and I no longer had to pretend that Patricia's treatment of me was acceptable, or that David's loyalty to his family was admirable. I could finally see our relationship for what it really was: massive deception designed to use me as cover for their criminal activities. The knowledge was devastating but also liberating. I no longer had to wonder why I never felt truly accepted by David's family, or why my best efforts to earn their respect always fell short. They had never intended to accept me as an equal. They had only intended to use me as a prop in their elaborate performance of respectability. As I sat in the gathering darkness of that Friday evening, I began planning my next steps. I would need a criminal defense attorney to ensure that I wasn't charged as an accessory to David's family's crimes. I would need a divorce attorney to protect my assets and ensure a clean break from the Morrison family. And I would need to prepare for the media attention that would inevitably follow the announcement of Patricia's arrest. But most importantly, I needed to prepare for the moment when I would finally confront Patricia with the knowledge of what she really was. The woman who had spent months questioning my character and blaming me for my miscarriage was about to learn that I knew exactly what kind of person she was beneath her carefully constructed facade. The envelope containing all the evidence of her crimes was waiting in my safety deposit box, along with documentation of every cruel comment she had made and every attempt she had made to undermine my marriage. When the time came, I would be ready to use that information to ensure that Patricia Morrison finally faced the consequences of her actions. Justice was coming, and this time, I would be the one holding all the cards. Monday morning arrived with the kind of sharp winter clarity that made Chicago's skyline sparkle against the gray Lake Michigan horizon. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, the one I wore for my most important client presentations, knowing that today would require every ounce of professional confidence I could summon. The FBI raids were scheduled to begin at 8 a.m., and by noon, Patricia Morrison's carefully constructed world would be in ruins. I had spent the weekend in my empty house, methodically preparing for the storm that was about to break. David had called 17 times, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that ranged from tearful apologies to angry accusations. I deleted each message without listening to the end, having heard enough of his excuses and justifications to last a lifetime. My lawyer, Janet Whitmore, had been invaluable in helping me navigate the legal complexities of my situation. Janet was a former federal prosecutor who now specialized in defending white-collar crime cases, and she had immediately understood the precarious position I was in as the spouse of someone likely to be charged in a major financial conspiracy. "The good news is that your financial independence actually protects you here," Janet had explained during our emergency Saturday meeting. "You have your own income, your own assets, and clear documentation that you weren't involved in or aware of the family's criminal activities. The FBI is looking for people who knowingly participated in the scheme, not innocent spouses who were kept in the dark." Janet had also helped me understand my options regarding David and our marriage. While I couldn't be compelled to testify against my husband, the privilege didn't extend to protect him if I chose to cooperate with the investigation. Given what I knew about the family's use of my miscarriage as cover for their crimes, Janet strongly recommended that I consider providing information to prosecutors. As I drove toward my office that Monday morning, I felt a strange sense of anticipation mixed with dread. The next few hours would determine whether David faced criminal charges alongside his mother, and whether my marriage could survive the revelation of his betrayal. But regardless of what happened to David, I knew that Patricia's reign of manipulation and control was finally coming to an end. My phone rang just as I was parking in my office building's garage. The caller ID showed Margaret Chen's number, and her voice was tight with excitement when I answered. "It's happening," she said simply. "FBI agents are executing search warrants at the Morrison family home and business offices right now. Patricia was arrested at her house 20 minutes ago." The news should have brought me satisfaction, but instead I felt an odd emptiness. For months, I had been looking forward to this moment, imagining how it would feel to know that Patricia was finally facing consequences for her actions. But now that it was actually happening, I mostly felt sad about the waste and destruction her choices had created. "Are there any details about David?" I asked, dreading the answer. "Not yet," Margaret replied. "But given what you told me about his involvement, I expect he'll be arrested before the end of the day. The FBI doesn't usually wait when they have evidence of active participation in ongoing crimes." I thanked Margaret for the update and made my way up to my office, trying to focus on the client work that would provide a necessary distraction from the chaos about to engulf my personal life. But concentration proved impossible, as my phone buzzed constantly with calls from unknown numbers, reporters, I realized, who had somehow already gotten word of the arrests and were looking for comment from family members. Around 10 a.m., my assistant buzzed through with a call that made my stomach drop. "Mrs. Morrison Chen, there's a Detective Rodriguez from the Chicago Police Department on line 2. She says it's urgent." Detective Rodriguez's voice was professional, but sympathetic when I took the call. "Mrs. Morrison Chen, I'm calling to inform you that your husband, David Morrison, was arrested approximately 30 minutes ago on federal charges related to the Riverside Community Foundation investigation. He's being processed downtown, and he'll likely be arraigned later today." The confirmation of David's arrest hit me harder than I had expected. Despite everything I knew about his involvement in his family's crimes, part of me had still hoped that he might somehow be considered a minor player who could avoid prosecution. The reality of his arrest made the end of our marriage feel final and irrevocable. "Is there anything I need to do?" I asked Detective Rodriguez, my training as a forensic accountant automatically kicking in to help me think through the practical implications. "You should contact an attorney if you haven't already," she advised, "and you should be prepared for significant media attention over the next few days. This case is going to be front-page news." After ending the call, I sat in my office chair for several minutes, staring out at the Chicago skyline and trying to process the magnitude of what was happening. My husband was in federal custody, my mother-in-law was facing serious criminal charges, and my marriage was effectively over. But I was also free from the web of lies and manipulation that had been suffocating me for years. The first news reports appeared online around 11 a.m., and they were every bit as sensational as I had expected. The headlines focused on the scope of the charity embezzlement scheme and the prominent Chicago families involved. Patricia's arrest was described in detail, including dramatic accounts of FBI agents searching her Winnetka mansion and seizing boxes of financial records. By noon, the story had been picked up by national news outlets, and Patricia Morrison's name was trending on social media. The comment sections were filled with outrage about wealthy families stealing from charities, and several news organizations were already working on investigative pieces about the broader implications of the scandal. My phone rang constantly throughout the day, reporters seeking comment, colleagues expressing shock and concern, and David's extended family members looking for information about what was happening. I declined to speak with the media and kept my conversations with family members brief and non-committal. The most difficult call came from David himself, calling from the federal detention facility where he was being held pending his arraignment. His voice was shaky and defeated, barely recognizable as the confident man I had married. "Jessica, I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I need you to know how sorry I am," he said. "I never wanted any of this to happen, and I especially never wanted you to get hurt." His apology felt hollow and self-serving, focused more on his own guilt than on the actual harm he had caused. "David, you used my miscarriage as cover for your mother's crimes," I said quietly. "You allowed her to blame me for losing our baby while you knew she was stealing from children's charities. I can't think of anything more cruel than that." I know," he said desperately. "But it wasn't supposed to go that far. Mom just got carried away with trying to protect the family, and I didn't know how to stop it without making everything worse." The excuse was pathetic and revealing. Even now, facing federal charges and the end of his marriage, David was still making excuses for his mother's behavior and minimizing his own responsibility for the choices he had made. "I can't do this anymore, David," I said firmly. "I can't be married to someone who would participate in stealing from charity and then use my grief to cover it up. I'm filing for divorce." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute before David spoke again. "Jessica, please don't make any permanent decisions while everything is so chaotic. Let me get through this legal situation, and then we can talk about working things out." His suggestion that we might work things out after he dealt with his criminal charges showed how completely he misunderstood the nature of his betrayal. This wasn't a marriage problem that could be solved with counseling or compromise. It was a fundamental incompatibility of values and character that made any future relationship impossible. "There's nothing to work out," I said. "You've shown me who you really are, and I can't be married to that person. I hope you get the legal help you need, but our marriage is over." I ended the call and immediately contacted my divorce attorney to begin proceedings. The legal complexities would be significant, given David's criminal charges, and the likelihood that many of his family's assets would be subject to forfeiture. But I was determined to extract myself from the Morrison family's legal and financial problems as quickly and completely as possible. The media coverage intensified throughout the week, with new details emerging daily about the scope of the charity embezzlement scheme. Patricia and 3 other conspirators had been charged with racketeering, money laundering, and tax evasion in addition to the original embezzlement charges. David was charged as an accessory after the fact and with conspiracy to commit money laundering. The financial details that emerged in court documents were staggering. The conspiracy had diverted over $3 million from charitable organizations over 8 years, with the money being used to fund lavish lifestyles for the participating families. Patricia personally had received over $600,000 in stolen funds, which she had used to pay for luxury vacations, designer clothing, and home renovations. But the most damaging revelations concerned the specific charities that had been targeted. The stolen money had been earmarked for childhood cancer research, homeless shelters, food banks, and educational programs for underprivileged children. The victims weren't abstract institutions, but real families who had been denied services because the funds intended to help them had been diverted to pay for Patricia's country club membership and David's luxury car lease. The public reaction was swift and brutal. Patricia's name became synonymous with greed and moral bankruptcy, with social media users sharing stories about the charitable organizations that had been forced to cut programs due to funding shortfalls. Several families came forward with heartbreaking accounts of how the reduced services had affected their lives. David's extended family was also caught up in the scandal, with several relatives facing scrutiny about their knowledge of the scheme and their receipt of financial benefits. The Morrison family's social standing collapsed overnight, with former friends and associates rushing to distance themselves from the criminal enterprise. The media attention created challenges for me, as well, despite my determination to maintain privacy and distance from the scandal. Reporters camped outside my office building and our townhouse, hoping to get comments or photographs that could add a personal angle to their coverage of the story. I handled the attention by maintaining complete silence with the media while working with Janet to ensure that my legal and financial interests were protected. The divorce proceedings moved forward quickly, with David's criminal charges creating strong incentives for him to agree to a settlement that would allow me to retain my separate assets and avoid any liability for his family's crimes. The most satisfying moment came when I received a call from Detective Rodriguez informing me that the FBI wanted to interview me about my knowledge of the Morrison family's activities. The interview was scheduled for the following Monday, giving me a weekend to prepare for what I knew would be my opportunity to ensure that Patricia faced the full consequences of her actions. I spent Saturday organizing all the documentation I had gathered about Patricia's treatment of me following the miscarriage, including recordings of phone conversations where she had blamed me for losing the baby and suggested that my career was incompatible with motherhood. While these recordings weren't directly related to the financial crimes, they demonstrated Patricia's character and pattern of manipulation that would be relevant to her sentencing. The FBI interview took place in a sterile conference room downtown, with two agents asking detailed questions about my observations of the Morrison family's financial activities and discussions. I provided a thorough account of everything I had witnessed, including the conversations about asset restructuring and the unusual timing of certain financial decisions. But the most important part of the interview concerned Patricia's use of my miscarriage as cover for the family's criminal activities. I explained how she had intensified her criticism of my character following the pregnancy loss, creating a narrative that I was emotionally unstable and unreliable. The agents were particularly interested in David's admission that this strategy had been deliberate and coordinated. Mrs. Morrison-Chen, based on what you've told us, it appears that the defendants used your personal tragedy as a way to deflect attention from their criminal activities, Agent Martinez said. That kind of calculated manipulation could be relevant to their sentencing, as it demonstrates a pattern of using innocent people to facilitate their crimes. The validation was profound. For months, I had been told that I was oversensitive, that Patricia's criticism was well-intentioned, and that my reactions were unreasonable. Now, federal law enforcement agents were confirming that I had been deliberately manipulated as part of a criminal conspiracy. After the interview, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't expected. I had told my story to people who understood its significance, and I knew that Patricia's cruelty toward me would be part of the record when she faced sentencing. The emotional abuse had finally been acknowledged and documented as part of her pattern of criminal behavior. The legal proceedings moved quickly over the following months. Patricia pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges in exchange for a reduced sentence, but she still faced significant prison time and substantial financial penalties. David also pleaded guilty and received a lighter sentence in exchange for his cooperation with the ongoing investigation. The divorce was finalized 6 months after David's arrest, with a settlement that protected my assets and severed all legal ties to the Morrison family. I received no money from David or his family, but I also assumed no responsibility for their debts or legal obligations. The clean break was exactly what I wanted. Patricia's sentencing hearing provided the final chapter in our long conflict. She received 4 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay over $2 million in restitution to the charitable organizations she had robbed. During her allocution, she offered a brief apology that focused more on her family's suffering than on the harm she had caused to her victims. I attended the sentencing hearing, sitting in the back of the courtroom and watching as Patricia learned the consequences of her choices. When she turned to scan the gallery, our eyes met for a moment, and I saw recognition and perhaps a hint of fear in her expression. She understood that I knew everything about what she had done, not just to the charities, but to me personally. After the hearing, I walked out of the courthouse and into the bright Chicago sunshine, feeling truly free for the first time in years. Patricia Morrison would spend the next 4 years in federal prison, and I would spend that time rebuilding my life without the shadow of her manipulation and control. David served 18 months in minimum security prison and was released with 3 years of supervised probation. He attempted to contact me several times after his release, but I declined to see or speak with him. Our marriage was a closed chapter, and I had no interest in revisiting the pain and betrayal of that relationship. I threw myself back into my career with renewed energy and focus, finding that my professional reputation had actually been enhanced by my handling of the scandal. Clients respected my integrity and discretion during a difficult personal situation, and my business grew significantly as word spread about my character and professionalism. 2 years after Patricia's sentencing, I met Dr. Michael Torres at a medical conference where I was speaking about financial fraud in healthcare organizations. Michael was a pediatric oncologist who had been working with some of the charities that Patricia had robbed, and he was impressed by my knowledge of the case and my insights into preventing similar crimes. Our relationship developed slowly and naturally, built on mutual respect and shared values, rather than the intense passion and family drama that had characterized my marriage to David. Michael understood the importance of my career and supported my professional ambitions, while I admired his dedication to treating children with cancer and his commitment to ethical medical practice. We married in a small ceremony 3 years later, surrounded by close friends and chosen family, rather than the elaborate social performance that had marked my first wedding. The difference was striking. This celebration was about love and partnership, rather than status and appearance. Michael and I were blessed with twins 2 years after our wedding, healthy children who brought joy and purpose to our lives in ways I had never imagined possible. During my pregnancy with them, I often thought about the baby I had lost, and Patricia's cruel suggestion that my career had somehow caused the miscarriage. The irony was not lost on me that I successfully carried twins to term while working full-time, as a senior partner in my accounting firm. Patricia's theories about career women being unsuited for motherhood had been exposed as the manipulative lies they always were. Today, 5 years after Patricia's sentencing, I run my own forensic accounting practice, specializing in nonprofit financial audits. My work helps prevent the kind of fraud that Patricia perpetrated, and I take satisfaction in knowing that my expertise protects vulnerable organizations from financial predators. I rarely think about Patricia Morrison anymore, except when news articles mention her upcoming parole hearing or when former clients ask about my experience with the case. She became a cautionary tale about privilege, entitlement, and the consequences of believing that social status provides immunity from moral responsibility. David has apparently rebuilt his life as well, working as a physical therapist in a small town in Wisconsin and maintaining a low profile. We have no contact, and I have no curiosity about his current circumstances. That chapter of my life is closed permanently. Sometimes people ask if I regret not confronting Patricia directly about her treatment of me, or if I wish I had exposed her crimes sooner, but I've never felt that regret. The timing of her downfall was perfect. She had enough rope to hang herself completely, and her criminal activities were exposed through proper legal channels rather than personal revenge. The envelope of evidence I had carefully compiled never needed to be used as a weapon. It had served its purpose simply by existing, giving me the confidence and clarity to recognize Patricia's true character and the strength to walk away from a toxic situation. Justice was served not through my personal intervention, but through the patient work of law enforcement professionals and the inexorable consequences of Patricia's own choices. She destroyed herself far more thoroughly than I ever could have, and she did it by consistently choosing greed and manipulation over honesty and decency. The most important lesson I learned from the entire experience was that some people reveal their true character through their actions during times of crisis. Patricia's response to financial pressure was to steal from charity and blame others for her problems. David's response to difficult choices was to enable his mother's crimes and sacrifice his wife's well-being to protect his family's secrets. My response was to document the truth, protect my own integrity, and walk away from people whose values were fundamentally incompatible with mine. That choice led to temporary pain but lasting peace, while their choices led to temporary relief, but permanent consequences. Today, I'm grateful for Patricia's cruelty and David's betrayal. Because they forced me to discover my own strength and taught me the difference between love and manipulation. The missing chair at that Roman restaurant dinner table, the public, blame for my miscarriage, the constant criticism and control, all of it ultimately freed me to build a life based on authenticity rather than performance. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well and watching karma do its work. Patricia Morrison learned that lesson from a federal prison cell, and I learned it from the sunroom of my beautiful home, surrounded by a husband who truly loves me and children who will never know what it feels like to be used as pawns in someone else's criminal enterprise. The envelope that could have silenced them all was never needed. In the end, their own voices were enough to condemn them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.